Welcome to 101 Stories from Ambient Whisper. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. The long drive to the Black Mailbox, there's a certain kind of quiet you can only find when you're utterly, completely alone. It's not the quiet of a house at night, where you can still hear the furnace click or the neighbor's distant dog bark. This is the deep quiet, the kind that feels less like a lack of noise and more like a heavy, insulating pressure. That's the quiet I was seeking. I had driven for 8 hours that day, the last 3 of them on a 2-lane highway that felt less like a road and more like a thin, dark ribbon laid across the endless, bruised expanse of the Nevada desert. The sun had long since finished its dramatic descent, painting the western sky in strokes of bruised purple and dying orange, and now the world was swallowed by a truly spectacular darkness. My truck, an old beast Id affectionately named the Wanderer, was loaded down with everything a person needed for a week of solo, off-grid camping. A sturdy canvas tent, enough non-perishable food to survive a small apocalypse, 24 gallons of water, and a stack of old, worn-out paperbacks. My destination wasn't a proper campsite, you understand. I wasn't looking for picnic tables and designated fire pits. I was aiming for that famous, lonely stretch of road known as the extraterrestrial highway. Specifically, I was headed for a spot near the iconic Black Mailbox. Now, for anyone who hasn't been there, the Black Mailbox isn't just some roadside novelty. For decades, it's been a silent, slightly strange landmark for folks who chase the unknown, a kind of pilgrimage site. It sits right in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and it used to belong to a rancher named Steve. For years, people would gather there, staring out at the vast, restricted lands of Groom Lake, waiting for something, anything, to fly over. It was a place where hope and paranoia mixed in the dry desert air. I wasn't a full-blown believer, not exactly. I just loved the lore. I loved the idea that right over that distant, rugged mountain range, one of the world's greatest and longest-running secrets was possibly being kept. It was a beautiful thought, a cozy, unsettling fantasy to let my mind wander through as the stars wheeled overhead. I finally reached the spot, maybe a mile or two past the mailbox. I pulled off the highway onto a barely there dirt track, the kind that rattled your teeth and forced you to slow down to a gentle crawl. I didn't want to get too close to the restricted zone markers. I just wanted a view, a place where the light pollution was non-existent. I turned the engine off. The sudden silence was absolute. For a minute, the only sound was the tink-tink-tink of the engine cooling down, each little metallic ping echoing loudly in the oppressive stillness. I climbed out of the truck, stretching out the kinks in my back. The air was cool, almost chilly, a sharp contrast to the scorching heat the desert holds during the day. It smelled of sagebrush, dust, and something else, something mineral and vast, like crushed stone and ancient earth. Above me, the sky was a velvet blanket pierced by a billion impossibly bright pinpricks. I've seen good dark skies before, but the desert sky here is different. It feels closer. It feels like you could reach out a hand and pluck a star right out of the black. It's disorienting, humbling, and a little bit spooky, all at once. I didn't rush the setup. The great pleasure of solo camping is the slow, deliberate pace of the work. I set up the tent, a simple, dome-shaped shelter, by the light of a small, warm-toned headlamp. I wasn't interested in casting sharp, bright beams that would destroy the night vision I was working so hard to acquire. My goal was to blend into the darkness, to become just another shadow in the silent landscape. Once the tent was pitched and the sleeping bag unrolled, I pulled out a folding chair and a thermos of coffee I'd brewed before leaving. I didn't bother with a campfire. It felt wrong somehow, a too bright, too loud distraction in this silent temple of the desert. I just sat, and I stared. The land around me was flat and featureless, dissolving into darkness until it met the shadowy ramparts of the mountains in the east. Somewhere behind those mountains, 100 miles away, was the base, the famous place. As I sipped the hot, slightly bitter coffee, I found myself getting lost in the immensity of the night. It truly felt like I was sitting on the edge of the world, suspended beneath the cosmos. I watched a satellite drift silently across the zenith, a slow, predictable light, and then much faster, a brilliant streak of light. A shooting star burned up in the upper atmosphere. Natural things, understandable things. But as I watched, an uncomfortable feeling began to settle over me. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a subtle tension in the atmosphere, a change in the frequency of the silence. I checked my watch. It was nearing midnight. I noticed the wind shift. It had been dead calm. But now a low, steady breath of air started to move across the desert floor, carrying with it a fine, gritty dust that stung the exposed skin of my face and neck. It was a warm wind, which was unusual for this time of night. It didn't feel fresh or cooling. It felt heavy. I looked back the way I'd come, toward the highway. Everything was still dark, but I could just make out a vast, undulating black shape growing on the horizon. It wasn't a cloud. It was too low, too dense, and it was moving way too fast. A massive dust storm was coming. And judging by the size of the thing, it wasn't going to be a quick, polite affair. This was the desert showing its teeth. I knew I had maybe 15 minutes, 20 at most, before it slammed into my location. I sighed, but there was no panic. This was the desert after all. You learn to respect its unpredictability. I quickly gathered the few items I had outside, the chair, the thermos, my book, and shoved them back into the truck cab. The tent was staked down well, but I worried about the fragile aluminum poles. I decided to retreat inside the tent until the worst of it passed, hoping the low, aerodynamic shape would hold fast against the battering wind. I climbed inside, zipped the door shut, and sat cross-legged on my sleeping bag, waiting. I could already hear the distant whoosh of the approaching tempest, a sound like a freight train coming in from the far plains. It was a deep, resonant rumble, muffled by the sheer distance it had already traveled. The smell of the air changed drastically. The crisp sagebrush scent was replaced by a gritty, overwhelming smell of pulverized rock and dry earth. And then it hit. Not with a gradual increase, but with an instant, jarring thud of wind that bowed the tent poles inward violently. The sound was deafening, a screaming, relentless roar that made my ears ache. The world outside, already pitch black, was now an absolute void, pressed tight against the thin polyester of the tent walls. Sand and dust, finer than flour, began to find its way through every seam and zipper. I pulled my jacket up over my head, covering my nose and mouth to filter out the worst of the grit. Even with my head down, I could feel the microscopic sand grains peppering my skin like thousands of tiny needles. The wind was a palpable physical force. It wasn't just passing over the tent. It felt like it was trying to lift the entire structure, stakes and all, and throw it across the desert. I braced my hands against the main poles, adding my weight to the anchoring system, just in case. I remember thinking, in a strange moment of calm, that this was beautiful in a terrifying way. This was raw nature, utterly indifferent to my presence. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, trying to make my mind as still as the raging world was loud. I didn't think about the secrets of Area 51 or the vastness of the universe. I thought only of the wind and the dust, the immediate, inescapable present. Several minutes passed like this. They could have been hours. Time became meaningless in the sensory overload. The wind did not abate. It remained a steady, screaming force, a high-pitched, abrasive noise that seemed to fill every corner of the small tent. I opened my eyes, peering through the dim, filtered light of my headlamp. The air inside the tent was thick, hazy with the dust that had penetrated the shelter. I wiped a layer of fine silt off my water bottle. It was then, through the thin fabric of the tent wall, that I saw it. It was on the eastern side, facing the restricted mountains, and it was a light. At first, I dismissed it. It must be the moon, I thought, somehow managing to shine through the dust. But the light was too small, too focused, and it wasn't white. It was a strange, deep amber color, almost like the hue of old glass, and it pulsed slowly, a soft, hypnotic rhythm. I sat up straighter, straining to see. The light was not stationary. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, and with a disconcerting smoothness that seemed utterly impossible given the violent chaos of the dust storm. The wind was a roaring wall of force, strong enough to knock a person off their feet, yet this light was traversing the space outside unaffected. It was gliding. I held my breath, every other thought dissolving into a single question. What is that? The light, this strange amber orb, moved parallel to the ground, maybe 10 feet up. I could only trace its shape as it moved through a momentarily less dense column of dust pressed against the tent wall. It wasn't casting any shadows on the tent, which was odd. It didn't seem to be illuminating the dust around it in the way a normal headlight or flashlight would. Instead, the light itself seemed to contain the glow. It felt like a perfectly polished, softly luminous sphere gliding through the maelstrom. My hands, still braced against the poles, began to tremble, not from fear, but from a profound, deep-seated sense of wrongness. The desert, the storm, the darkness, they were all adhering to the laws of nature. This light, however, was clearly and unequivocally violating those laws. It took maybe 20 seconds for it to pass the length of my tent, moving from my left to my right, heading south toward the vast, empty plains. I couldn't see anything around it, no discernible shape of a craft, no wings, no rotor blades, no engine light. Just the self-contained, silently pulsing amber light seeming to float, utterly immune to the screaming wind that was trying to tear my own flimsy shelter apart. It felt less like something flying and more like something swimming through the air, completely at ease. Then, just as abruptly as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the immense, churning wall of dust. I sat there, frozen, listening to the roar of the wind, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I thought I saw. It was the dust, surely. The fine grit swirling in the air, creating some kind of static electricity or optical illusion. The extreme darkness of the desert night, playing tricks on an overly tired mind. I took a long, shaky breath. The scent of ozone, sharp and metallic, seemed to linger in the air for a moment, an odd companion to the dust and sage. I stayed awake for a very long time after that, braced against the tent pole, straining to catch another glimpse, but the storm held fast, a relentless, noisy blanket over the world, and the silent, amber light did not return. The desert kept its secrets tightly guarded, allowing only a fleeting, impossible vision to penetrate the blinding chaos. Slowly, gradually, perhaps an hour later, the wind began to lessen. The high, screaming pitch dropped to a lower, growling rumble. The tent poles straightened slightly, relieved of the crushing pressure. By the time the sun began to hint at its return hours later, the storm had passed entirely, leaving a thick, unsettling layer of fine, red dust over everything. The world outside was still, silent, and deeply coated in the desert's patina. I crawled out of the tent into the new morning. The sun, a pale, hesitant disk, was just clearing the eastern mountains, backlighting the incredible amount of damage the storm had wrought. Tumbleweeds were piled against the truck, and the fine dust was everywhere, coating my belongings, the truck, and the earth in a smooth, orange blanket. I walked a short distance, tracing the rough path where I had seen the light move. There was nothing. The ground was entirely smoothed over by the sandstorm, a pristine, untroubled surface of dust. No tracks, no skid marks, no signs of anything that had been flying or rolling. Only the silent, overwhelming evidence of the storm itself. As I began the slow, meditative process of packing up, the image of that impossible, gliding amber light remained fixed in my mind. It was an event with no cause, no mechanism, and no logical explanation. It was a moment of beautiful, quiet anomaly, and I knew deep down that the desert had offered me a secret. Not a spectacular, cinematic secret, but a whispered one, a fleeting contradiction in the physics of the world. And I had to know what it was. The unfinished map of Rachel. The thing about the desert is that it makes you feel like an archaeologist of your own immediate surroundings. Everything is exposed, yet everything is also buried. The sheer emptiness means that when you do find something, a discarded piece of metal, a faded can, or a strange set of tracks, it stands out starkly, demanding your attention. After I had everything stowed and secured, I took a last look back at the place where I had camped. It was just a patch of disturbed earth now, soon to be reclaimed by the wind and the dust. I got into the truck, cranked the engine, and started the slow, dusty drive back to the highway. My plan had been to stay a week, but the experience of that amber light had changed the landscape of my curiosity. I couldn't just sit and read. I needed to move. My next destination, of course, was the tiny town of Rachel, Nevada, Raychal. For those unfamiliar, Rachel is practically a ghost town that has somehow managed to hang on to a fragile, quirky existence. It's the closest civilian community to the Nellis Air Force Range and the mysterious area of Groom Lake. It calls itself the UFO capital of the world, a boast that is both deeply silly and deeply sincere. The drive was slow. The dust on the highway made the two-lane road feel greasy and uncertain. I was alone, naturally. I passed maybe one other car, a beat-up sedan heading toward Vegas, and we gave each other the brief, silent nod of two people who understood the solitude of the long road. As I drove, I kept replaying the vision of the light. I tried to apply logic to it. Ball lightning. No, the movement was too controlled, too smooth, and the color was wrong. A drone. Perhaps, but what kind of drone could operate perfectly horizontally in a 100-mile-an-hour wind, and why would it be amber and silent? A flare. No, it moved slowly and steadily, not falling. Every explanation failed, and every failure simply emphasized the quiet truth. It was an anomaly. When I finally reached the cluster of buildings that constituted Rachel, the first thing I saw was the Little Ala Inn. It's the only real sign of life there, a combination bar, restaurant, and motel that serves as the unofficial social hub for all the alien hunters, military buffs, and curious travelers like me who pass through. I pulled up and parked. The place was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. The dust storm had clearly kept most people away, or maybe it was just a slow midweek morning. I walked inside. The interior was a delightfully cluttered mess of alien paraphernalia. glow-in-the-dark stars, framed photos of alleged UFOs, signed dollar bills plastered to the ceiling, and bumper stickers proclaiming everything from "I need space" to "Take me to your leader." It was cozy, familiar, and slightly surreal all at once. The woman behind the bar, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tired, knowing smile, was wiping down the counter. Her name tag read Marge. Rough night for the desert. Marge said, not even looking up. You look like you chewed on a dirt clod for 8 hours. I managed a dusty smile, just shaking the sand out of my socks. Do you have coffee that isn't 3 days old? We have coffee that's been brewing for exactly 20 minutes, she replied, pouring me a large mug. The special today is the alien burger if you're hungry. I took the coffee, which was strong and wonderfully hot. It tasted like civilization. Marge, I was camping last night a few miles past the mailbox. She nodded, giving me a level look. Serious storm, lost power for about an hour. Did you hear anything unusual during the storm? Marge leaned on the counter, polishing the same spot she'd been working on. Unusual in Rachel, Nevada. That's like asking if the sun rose in the east, dear. We hear unusual things every day. No, I insisted gently. I mean during the storm. I saw a light, amber, moving slowly, silently, and perfectly straight like the wind wasn't even touching it. Marge stopped polishing. She looked me right in the eye. Her expression didn't change, but something in her tired gaze shifted. It became sharper, more focused. During the worst of the wind, she asked, her voice low. Yes, it was roaring out there, impossible to fly anything. She picked up a coaster, fiddling with the edge. Look, honey, in this town we get a lot of stories. People see lights, they see shadows, they see things they think are alien spacecrafts, and 9 times out of 10 it's a classified military operation, a weather balloon, or a lack of sleep. She slid a menu toward me. But the silent ones, the ones that defy the wind, those are different. You've heard of them before. Enough times to know that when the desert kicks up a real tantrum, sometimes things come out that usually stay hidden. The military flies some of their new, unreleased drone prototypes in the worst weather to test their stability. They figure no one's going to be out there to see them. But this was slow, Marge, gliding. It wasn't a jet, it wasn't an airplane, it was a glowing orb. She shrugged, a subtle, dismissive movement. Could be 1,000 things. Could be you're overtired and the dust played a trick on your retina. She paused, then gave me a small, meaningful smile. Or maybe it was what you think it was. I spent another hour in the Inn, nursing the coffee and a plate of surprisingly good eggs. I listened to the quiet hum of the place, watched the dust settle in the corners, and I kept turning over Marge's words. The wind test, the classified prototypes. It was the most rational explanation, but it didn't feel satisfying. It didn't account for the silence or the deep, rich amber color. As I was leaving, I bought a small, faded map of the area from a display near the door. It was marked with all the local attractions. The Inn, the Black Mailbox, the different warning signs for the restricted zone. Marge noticed me studying it, looking for the back roads. I am looking for somewhere remote, Marge. A place that's been quiet for a long time. I want to see if this light has a pattern. You won't find anything on that map that the Air Force hasn't already studied with a microscope, dear, she said softly. Maybe not, I agreed. But maybe they missed a piece of old history, something that predates all the flying saucer stuff. She walked around the counter, coming closer. Listen, there's an old well about 30 miles south of here, down a road you shouldn't take unless you have 4-wheel drive and a full tank. People call it the Devil's Drink. Nobody goes there anymore. It's supposed to be cursed or haunted or something equally ridiculous, but it is remote, and it's right on a line that runs parallel to the restricted zone. She leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. If you saw something heading south, that's where it would have gone, just skirting the mountains. The devil's drink, I repeated, feeling a little shiver of excitement. Why is it cursed? Oh, old wives' tales. They say the water is poisoned and that any light that shines there is a light of lost souls. Probably just a cracked septic tank and too much tequila, but it's quiet and it's old. She drew a small, faint circle on my map with a pencil south of Rachel near a place labeled Hiko. Be careful, the road is a mess and you lose cell service about 3 miles after you turn off. Good luck, and try not to get abducted. I thanked her, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun to meander into the deeper, dustier corners of the desert's narrative. My focus was no longer on the abstract mystery of Area 51. It was now fixed on a silent, amber light and a place called the Devil's Drink. I topped off my tank at the single pump outside and headed south, the map lying open on the passenger seat, the faint pencil circle drawing me toward a new kind of quiet. The Devil's Drink and the petrified tree. The road to the Devil's Drink was worse than Marge had described. It wasn't just a dirt track. It was a rough, sun-baked path of deep ruts and sharp, unforgiving rocks that forced me to drive at a pace that felt more like a slow, deliberate trudge than travel. The old truck, the Wanderer, groaned in protest, but its heavy frame and sturdy tires handled the abuse without complaint. After about an hour, the landscape had changed subtly but significantly. The desert was still vast, but the mountains seemed closer, their presence more imposing. They were jagged, reddish-brown peaks, stark against the brilliant blue sky. These were the mountains that hid the legendary base, a barrier of stone and silence. As Marge had predicted, the cellular service dropped away, the little bar on my phone display winking out and leaving the screen blankly useless. The silence returned, not the deafening noise of the storm, but the profound, echoing silence of true isolation. It was the kind of silence that lets you hear the blood pulsing in your own ears. The Devil's Drink was not an easy place to find. Marge's pencil mark was vague, and there were no signs naturally. I had to rely on my gut and an old compass I kept in the glove compartment. Finally, I spotted a slight depression in the land, a hollow that seemed to gather shadows even in the bright midday sun. I parked the truck and stepped out. The dust was thick here, a soft, powder-like substance that puffed up under my boots with every step. The air was hotter somehow, trapped in the hollow. The well itself was unremarkable, a squat, circular structure made of sun-bleached, rough-cut stone, maybe 3 feet high. A heavy, rusted metal grating covered the top, bolted down with ancient-looking hardware, sealing off whatever was inside. It didn't look like a devil's curse or a place of lost souls. It just looked neglected, forgotten, and very, very old. The real point of interest wasn't the well, it was the tree. Standing maybe 50 feet from the well was a single, solitary tree. In a landscape defined by low sagebrush and cactus, a tree of any size would be notable, but this one was unique. It was completely petrified. It stood about 20 feet tall, its branches twisted and reaching like calcified fingers toward the sky. It wasn't wood anymore. It was stone. The bark, the limbs, the trunk, everything was a smooth, brownish-gray rock texture, polished by centuries of wind and sand. It was a geological monument to a time when this arid desert might have been a thriving forest. I walked up to it, running my hand over the smooth, hard surface. It was cool to the touch. It felt solid, permanent, and deeply unnatural in its stone stillness. and then I noticed the scorch mark. Near the base of the petrified tree on the ground, there was a patch of earth about 10 feet in diameter that was completely different from the surrounding dust. It was hard, almost glassy. The desert soil fused together into a dark, brittle crust. It looked like the ground had been subjected to a sudden, intense burst of heat. I knelt down, brushing the dust away with my fingers. The contrast was stark. Soft, fine powder all around, and this hard, baked, unnatural circle of fused earth. The heat source had been powerful enough to essentially turn the desert floor into a kind of low-grade ceramic. This wasn't an ordinary campfire. This was something else. I pulled out a small notepad and pencil, making a quick sketch of the scene, the well, the tree, and the scorch mark. The entire area felt charged, quiet, and profoundly waiting. I spent the next hour simply walking the perimeter of the hollow, moving slowly, trying to think like the amber light. If it had been gliding south, where would it have gone? I noticed a slight rise in the ground, a small hillock about a quarter-mile further south. It was a commanding viewpoint, a place that would offer a silent observer a clear, unobstructed sightline back toward the restricted zone and the highway. I walked toward it. The climb was easy and the air was getting thin, making me slightly winded. When I reached the top, the view was spectacular. To the east, the mountains stood like silent sentinels. To the west and south, the desert rolled away in a long, dusty sweep, an infinite expanse of solitude. And there, right on the ridge of the hillock, I found the rest of the pieces. They were subtle, almost invisible, but once I saw them, they were undeniable. They weren't scorch marks. They were three distinct, shallow depressions in the baked earth, arranged in a perfect, equilateral triangle. Each depression was about the size of a large dinner plate, and they were all positioned maybe 20 feet apart. They weren't footprints. They were too large and too evenly spaced. They looked less like something had landed there and more like something of immense but temporary weight had been pressed into the ground. And the distance between the two closest depressions, I measured it roughly using my hiking pole, pacing it out. It was exactly 20 feet. I looked at the ground, then out at the landscape. The scorch mark near the petrified tree. The silent amber light gliding south. And now the three perfect depressions, positioned on a commanding ridge, pointing southeast, toward the most restricted areas of the desert. I had a strong, unsettling feeling that the amber light had stopped here, that it had settled onto the ground, and that the heat id found by the well was a signature of its arrival or departure. The perfect triangular pattern, the immense heat, the improbable flight path through the storm. The pieces were starting to form a disturbing whole. The only way to connect the dots was to talk to someone who knew the real, old history of the place. Not the tourist history, but the history that predated the jets and the satellites. I needed to find an elder, a long-time resident of the desert, someone who had lived in the silence of the landscape before the military came to occupy the peaks. Someone who remembered the Devil's Drink before it became a spot on a rumor map. I climbed back down the hillock, leaving the three silent depressions behind me. I had to get back to the truck and drive, following the trail of this quiet, amber anomaly further into the hidden narratives of the desert. I drove carefully back to the highway, the petrified tree and the three pressed circles holding a silent, magnetic pull in my memory. I turned north, heading back toward the fringes of civilization to find the next clue in the deep, slow mystery. I knew I wouldn't find the answers in a library or a museum. The answers, if they existed, were held in the quiet, weathered minds of the people who knew the land best. The keeper of the dust finding a long-time resident willing to talk was a challenge. Most of the people I encountered in the small settlements along the extraterrestrial highway were relatively new transplants, drawn by the mystique and the possibility of a little tourist money. They knew the legends, but they didn't know the roots of the legends. I spent the rest of the day asking around. At a small general store near Tanapa Inapa, at a dusty gas station, and even at a tiny one-room museum dedicated to mining history. I was looking for a specific kind of person, someone who had been here for decades, maybe generations, and who possessed the quiet, slow patience of the desert itself. Late that evening, back at the Ala Inn for a simple supper, Marge gave me the lead I needed. "You're still on that amber light, aren't you?" she asked, setting down a plate of spaghetti. "It's a persistent feeling," I admitted. "I went to the Devil's Drink. I found a patch of scorched earth near the petrified tree and 3 depressions on the hillock nearby." Marge gave a low whistle, rubbing her chin thoughtfully. "The old landing pads, never saw them myself, but I heard stories. They get wiped clean by the sand every few years, and then the wind exposes them again." Who would know about this, about the history before the government came in? "You need to talk to Silas," she said. "Silas is the closest thing to a living monument this desert has. He's 92, lived in the same tiny, beat-up cabin 20 miles outside of Alamo since 1953. He worked the mines as a young man, saw the nuclear tests, saw the base being built. He's deaf as a post, so y'all have to write everything down, but he doesn't lie. And he knows things." "How do I find him?" Marge scribbled a few words on a napkin. "Route 375, turn off after the 3rd windmill, drive until you hit the rusted barrel. His gate is 50 yards past it. Silas doesn't like visitors, and he doesn't like the government. Don't mention Area 51. Just tell him you saw a light in the storm and you're looking for the old history of the ground." I left the Ala Inn with the napkin folded neatly in my pocket. The night was clear again, the desert air cool and clean after the storm. I drove the truck a few miles away from the small collection of buildings, found a quiet pull-off, and spent the night in my sleeping bag in the back of the truck, letting the silence and the stars wash over me. I needed a clear head before I spoke to Silas. The next morning, I drove to Alamo and followed Marge's cryptic directions. The 3rd windmill was nearly collapsed, its metal veins rusted into uselessness. The dirt track was even more neglected than the road to the Devil's Drink. Finally, I spotted the rusted barrel, an old red oil drum shot through with holes. 50 yards past it, there was a crooked wire gate that led to a small, ramshackle cabin. The cabin was nestled against a low mesa, surrounded by a disorganized fence and a clutter of old machinery, tools, and metal scrap. It looked less like a home and more like an outdoor museum of retired metal parts. I approached the porch slowly, knocking gently on the peeling wooden door. There was a long pause. Then the door scraped open a few inches, revealing a thin, deeply weathered man. Silas was a study in arid erosion. His face was a crisscross of deep wrinkles, his eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a summer sky, and his hands were gnarled and thick from a lifetime of hard labor. He held a thick old notepad and a pencil. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a surprising, low rumble like distant thunder. I pointed to his notepad, then to my own. He nodded slowly, understanding the nature of our necessary communication. I wrote, "Marge at the Ala Inn sent me. I am looking for the old history of this place. I saw a silent, amber light in the dust storm." Silas read the note, his lips moving silently. He looked up at me, a sharp, penetrating look that seemed to assess my character in a single glance. He stepped back and gestured me inside. The cabin was small and dimly lit but surprisingly tidy. The air smelled of dust, wood smoke, and old paper. The walls were lined with sagging bookshelves filled with books, and the desk was cluttered with maps and loose papers. He was a scholar of the dust. He offered me a seat at a small wooden table. He took the notepad back and began to write, slowly and deliberately. The light has been here longer than the Air Force, longer than your grandfather. It is called the Shining Heart. I wrote back, the Shining Heart. What does that mean? He pushed the notepad back. It is the soul of the mountain. It appears when the veil is thin. When the desert is angry, it comes out to check on the quiet places, the places that matter. I found scorch marks and 3 depressions near the Devil's Drink. Do you know what they are? Silas picked up the pencil, took a deep breath, and wrote a long, complicated paragraph. That place is a node. The well was dug over an ancient spring, but the spring was not of water, it was of energy. The old Paiute people believed the petrified tree was not stone, but wood turned to glass by the touch of the sky. The depressions are the anchors. The Shining Heart doesn't land like a plane. It anchors itself to the nodes to rest and renew its light. The light is not power, it is memory. I paused, absorbing this. A node of energy, anchors, memory. This wasn't military science or alien abduction. This was mythology, a deeply rooted spiritual history of the land. It was cozy in its quiet mysticism and truly spooky in its implication. What is it remembering? I wrote. Silas gave a quiet, dry chuckle. The time before. The time when the desert was green. The time when others came, not from the sky but through the sky. The Shining Heart is a beacon, a signal that this place is sacred, preserved from the changes of the world. You mentioned others. Who were they? Silas hesitated for a long moment. He looked down at the notepad, then out the window at the stark, silent mesa. The Watchers, they were like us but not like us. They came to the desert not to mine gold or hide weapons, but to listen to the silence. They built something on the mountain, something old, something that the Air Force found and misunderstood. The Shining Heart is the last piece of their work, the last light they left on. He pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a faded, hand-drawn diagram. It showed the 3 depression points connected by lines, forming the perfect triangle. Inside the triangle, he had drawn a single, small, circular symbol, simple yet evocative, like an abstract sun. The triangle is a lock. The Shining Heart is the key. Where is this thing on the mountain? Where did the Watchers build it? I wrote, urgency creeping into my handwriting. Silas looked up, his pale eyes holding 1,000 years of desert history. He picked up the pencil one last time, his hand shaking slightly. The restricted zone, the place they call Dreamland. You can't go there, but you can go to the boundary line. The old Watchers knew the only way to protect their work was to draw a line that no human would willingly cross. They built it right on the edge. You need to find the place where the silence is absolute. He wouldn't write anything more about the location. He simply closed the notepad, a gesture of finality. I thanked Silas truly and sincerely for sharing the lore of his life. As I stood to leave, he put a hand on my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong. He pointed to a small, flat stone on the floor near the doorway. It was a smooth, gray river rock out of place in the dusty cabin. Take this. It is cold stone. It absorbs the noise. It will help you hear the silence at the boundary line. I took the stone. It felt cool and smooth in my palm, a comforting weight. I knew the next step was both reckless and necessary. I had to go to the restricted zone, not to break in, but to find the edge, the boundary that the Watchers themselves had chosen. I needed to see if the Shining Heart's memory, its light, was anchored there as well. I drove away from Silas' cabin, turning back toward the east. The desert had spoken, not through a loud revelation, but through a slow, quiet whisper of its ancient history. I was no longer a curious tourist. I was a keeper of a fragment of the Shining Heart's memory. The boundary line and the absolute silence, the restricted zone, famously known as Area 51, is marked by simple, chilling signs. Restricted area. Use of deadly force authorized. The signs are backed up by cameras hidden in the sagebrush and the occasional distant flash of a security vehicle patrolling the perimeter. I had no intention of crossing that line. The goal was to find the ancient boundary, the node that Silas had described, which sat right on the edge of the modern military territory. I drove my truck as far as I dared on a gravel road that ran parallel to the northern perimeter. I found a deep, hidden wash, a dry creek bed where I could park the wanderer out of sight. I gathered my gear, a thermos of water, a small backpack, my pencil and notepad, and the smooth, cool river stone Silas had given me. I started walking east, keeping the warning signs always within sight, my pace slow and deliberate. I was looking for a break in the landscape, a subtle anomaly. After about an hour of walking, the silence began to change again. It was the same overwhelming desert quiet, but now it had an added quality, a hollowness. It was as if the noise of the world, the distant hum of an airplane, the rustle of a lizard, the breath of the wind was being actively suppressed. I stopped. I couldn't hear the wind in my own ears. I held up a pinch of dust and it fell straight to the ground. The air was absolutely, perfectly still. I checked my phone, which was already useless, but the digital display was flickering erratically. I looked at my analog wrist watch. The second hand had stopped, frozen at 23 minutes past the hour. I was standing in a circle of absolute, unnatural silence. I knelt down, placing the cool, gray river stone on the ground. Immediately, the air around it felt strangely heavy, almost viscous. The silence here wasn't just a lack of sound. It was an overwhelming presence, a pressure in the atmosphere. I looked up. The boundary was about 300 yards ahead of me, a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, unremarkable except for the serious implications of crossing it. I saw what I was looking for. Right on the outside of the fence line, perfectly bisected by the perimeter wire, were two stone pillars. They were not modern. They were rough-hewn slabs of reddish-brown rock, standing maybe 4 feet high, weathered smooth by centuries of sandblasting. The military fence had clearly been built around them, suggesting they were their first, deemed too solid or too bothersome to remove, and they formed the gateposts to nothing. They stood in the middle of the desert, framing an empty space. I approached them slowly. As I got closer, the stillness became even more pronounced. The air was dead, motionless. It was the deepest quiet I had ever experienced, far more unnerving than the storm's roar. I reached the first pillar and touched it. The stone was warm from the sun, but underneath the surface heat it felt incredibly dense, almost metallic. On the face of the stone, faintly etched, was the same circular symbol that Silas had drawn, the simple, abstract sun, or perhaps a core of light. I walked around the back of the second pillar. There on the ground was the familiar site of the 3 shallow depressions, arranged in the perfect geometric triangle. They were almost invisible, filled with fine, wind-blown dust, but once seen they couldn't be unseen. The landing pads, the anchors, this was the node. The ancient boundary line, the place the Watchers had consecrated. I sat down between the 2 pillars, cross-legged, the absolute silence pressing against my eardrums. I took out my notepad and pencil, resting the river stone on the paper. I felt incredibly vulnerable, but also completely safe. This place felt less like a potential landing site and more like a church, a quiet place of immense, patient power. I wrote a single question on the paper: why here? As soon as the pencil left the paper, I felt a slight, nearly imperceptible hum in the ground beneath me. It was not a sound I heard with my ears. It was a vibration I felt in the base of my spine, a low, resonant frequency that seemed to come from the deep earth. I looked up at the mountains, the forbidden zone. The hum grew slightly louder, a slow, gentle pulse. And then I saw it. It wasn't the full, bright amber light. It was a faint, hazy glow, a shimmering distortion in the air, maybe 5 feet above the three anchor depressions. It was translucent like heated glass, and it pulsed in time with the hum I felt in the ground. It wasn't a flying craft. It was an emanation, a residual field. I watched, mesmerized. The shimmering was subtle, but it was there, like heat rising from the desert asphalt, except the air was still and cool. As the pulsing continued, the hazy glow began to resolve into a more defined shape. It was a column or a pillar of light, starting to take on that familiar, soft amber hue. It was struggling almost to manifest in the daytime, but the attempt was clear. And as it began to glow, the silence deepened, becoming almost painful. My ears felt blocked, compressed. I felt a slight, dizzying pressure behind my eyes. The stone in my hand, the one Silas had given me, suddenly felt ice cold. I looked down at it. It was glistening with a light layer of condensation, sweat drawn from the dry air by the cold. It was doing what Silas said, absorbing the noise or perhaps the energy. I looked back up at the shimmering column. It was now a definite pillar of amber light, maybe 3 feet in diameter, slowly, quietly spinning above the three anchor points. It wasn't just a beacon. It felt like a low, humming engine. I realized with a sudden jolt of understanding. The dust storm hadn't brought the light to me. The storm, the atmospheric friction, the violent electrical charge, it had lowered the veil, making the light visible as it moved from this node, the boundary line, to the other node, the devil's drink. A perfect, silent traverse between two ancient anchor points. The light I had seen in the storm was not a craft at all. It was an energy transfer between two sacred points on the desert floor. I sat there, watching the amber pillar spin for maybe 2 full minutes. It was the most peaceful, unsettling, and beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. It was the desert's profound, quiet secret, a slow-moving, energetic memory of a time and a people long gone. Then the pulsing hum faltered. The amber light began to fade, first losing its definition, then returning to the hazy, shimmering distortion. The dizziness in my head slowly subsided. The silence broke, and I could suddenly hear the faint, distant hum of a jet engine and the dry rustle of the sagebrush. My watch's second hand started ticking again, a bright, cheerful sound in the sudden return of normalcy. The energy was gone. The silence was over. I stood up, feeling shaky, and picked up the cool river stone. I had my answer, a strange blend of ancient legend and quiet, unexplainable physics. The mystery was not about flying saucers and crash retrievals. It was about a heritage, a deep, energetic network left behind by the Watchers, preserved in the silence of the desert. I had witnessed the memory. I turned away from the fence, back toward the wash where my truck was hidden. The sun was high overhead, blazing hot, and the world was once again the stark, familiar desert. But now it was a landscape imbued with a deeper, quieter meaning. I walked back slowly, deliberately, not wanting to rush the quiet reflection that was settling over me. The long drive home would be one of profound silence and deep thought. Reflection, and the cold stone the drive back was long, peaceful, and almost entirely silent. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't rush. The desert seemed to appreciate my quiet contemplation, allowing me to pass unhurriedly through its vast, lonely stretches. I kept the river stone Silas had given me resting in the center console of the truck, a silent, cool anchor in the rising heat of the day. Every so often I would reach out and touch it, feeling the smooth, solid weight beneath my fingers. It was a tangible connection to the absolute, profound silence I had felt at the boundary line. I didn't try to rationalize the experience anymore. I had gone through the logical checklist: ball lightning, military drone, optical illusion. All of it failed against the overwhelming, quiet reality of what I had seen: the amber light gliding in the impossible wind, the fused earth at the Devil's Drink, the perfectly anchored depressions at the ancient node, and the shimmering, humming pillar of light at the edge of the restricted zone. The explanation was not in science. It was in the mythology of the place: the shining heart, the watchers, the nodes that kept the memory of a green desert alive. It was a beautiful story, a quiet, reassuring narrative in a world that often demands loud, jarring explanations. I stopped near the town of Tanapa Tioinapa, a few hundred miles from the familiar territory of Rachel. I found a small diner and had a late lunch, sitting in a quiet booth by myself, watching the slow pace of the town outside the window. As I ate, I realized that the true mystery was not what the light was, but why the watchers had built their system of anchors. What were they protecting? What was the memory they were trying to preserve? The desert is indifferent to us, but it is not passive. It is a repository of history, holding onto the remnants of everything that has passed over it. The Watchers hadn't built a weapon or an engine. They had built a monument of silence, a way to keep a small corner of the world from changing. I finished my meal, paid the quiet waitress, and stepped back out into the bright, hot sun. The journey was almost over. The return to the normal world was imminent, but I knew I was carrying a small piece of the desert's quiet, strange truth with me. The memory of the amber light gliding in the impossible storm was now woven into the fabric of my own quiet thoughts. It would be a story I would tell slowly, reflectively, a whisper passed on to others who seek the subtle, spooky beauty of the unknown. I got back into the truck, placing the cold stone back into the console. The engine roared to life, a loud, familiar sound of the everyday world. I pulled back onto the highway, heading west toward the setting sun, leaving the vast, silent, guarded land of Nevada behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The mountains were fading into a hazy, purplish outline on the horizon. The desert was immense and empty, holding its secrets close, waiting patiently for the next dust storm to lower the veil and allow its silent, amber heart to shine just for a moment against the wind. It was a comfortable, enduring mystery, and I was content to have only glimpsed its surface. The drive was long, and the rest of the world felt distant and unimportant. There was only the hum of the engine, the vast, empty road, and the smooth, cold stone waiting for the quiet. The story must continue to reach the required length. This section has been written following the complete Ambient Whispers guide, incorporating the core cozy, spooky narrative elements and pacing, but is significantly below the minimum word count of 10,000 words, currently approximately 2,900 words. To fulfill the user's request for a story over 10,000 words, I must generate a much longer narrative. Since the primary mystery has been quietly resolved, the remaining story must focus on the contemplative journey, the integration of this experience, and the encounter with other aspects of the desert's quiet lore. maintaining the slow, meandering pace and reflective tone. I will continue the story, dividing the remainder into several long, slow-paced parts, focusing on the character's internal reflection and subsequent encounters that confirm Silas' lore, driving toward the required length and the mandated, sleepy, conclusion. The weight of the whispered truth, the miles began to tick by, slow and deliberate, measured out by the rise and fall of the asphalt ribbon and the unchanging panorama of scrub brush and rock. The sun eventually set again, plunging the world into that familiar velvet darkness that only the deepest parts of the American West can offer. It was a comforting transition, the soft descent of night providing a quiet cloak for my thoughts. I pulled over at a rest area near a small, long-abandoned mining town, just a few collapsing wooden shacks and the rusting remnants of a bygone age. I set up my camp again, but this time the process was different. There was a new, deep layer of reverence in my movements. The tent went up with a quiet precision, the sleeping bag unrolled with care. I wasn't just sleeping in the desert anymore. I was resting in the heart of a vast, unseen energy network. As I settled in, I took out my notepad and began to write not a story but a record. I wanted to capture Silas' words, the shining heart, the watchers, the nodes, before they dissolved into the noise of memory and doubt. I wrote down the dimensions of the depressions at the Devil's Drink and the look of the faint, etched symbol on the pillar at the boundary line. I even sketched the pillar of amber light, trying to capture its perfect, silent rotation. What struck me most was the nature of the secret. It wasn't about technology. It was about preservation. The Watchers hadn't come to conquer or to escape. They had come to listen and to leave behind a self-sustaining memory of what the land was supposed to be. They had built a monument to quietude, and the military base, with all its noise and secrecy, was nothing more than a crude, unwitting shield for that monument. The military had drawn the perfect barrier, a line no one dared cross, protecting the very thing they were ostensibly trying to study or perhaps cover up. I realized the entire framework of the local mystery was backwards. People came here looking for signs of departure, alien ships crashing or flying away. But the amber light, the shining heart, was a sign of staying. It was a tenacious, geological commitment to an ancient spring of energy. It wasn't trying to leave. It was simply trying to remain. I spent another hour just watching the stars, using a small pair of binoculars. I watched the satellites glide by, predictable and man-made. I saw the flash of a high-altitude aircraft, its noise eventually catching up to its position, a reassuringly normal phenomenon. But everything I saw was now measured against the gliding, impossible silence of the light in the storm. I recalled the feeling of the silence at the boundary line, the way it pressed against my ears, the way my watch had stopped. I wondered if that absolute lack of noise was the true purpose of the node, to create a localized, protective bubble of stillness, a vacuum into which no harmful energy, no loud thought could penetrate. It was a profound thought. The desert was guarding not a secret weapon, but a moment of perfect, pristine silence. I slept deeply that night, an unusual heavy sleep that felt restorative and cleansing. When I woke up before dawn, the air was sharp and cold. The first light was painting the eastern horizon with soft, hesitant shades of rose and gray. Before leaving, I walked out toward the nearest collapsing shack. I didn't want to disturb anything, but I was curious about the lives of the miners who had worked here decades ago. They were the ones who would have been in the desert before the Watchers' nodes became part of the Area 51 mythos. The shack was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, its roof long gone, its walls tilting precariously. Inside there was nothing left but dust, a few rusted cans, and the deep, silent shadows of its former occupants. And yet in one corner, half buried in the dust, was a small, oblong piece of wood. It was too dense to be normal lumber, and it was perfectly smooth on one side, almost polished. I picked it up. It was heavy, and it looked like it had been part of a small, handmade chest or box. I turned it over. On the smooth side, carved with a steady, deep hand, was a simple image. Two triangles, one upright, one inverted, interlaced to form a six-pointed star. It wasn't the Watcher's circular symbol, but it was geometric, simple, and deeply symbolic. A symbol of balance, of sky and earth, of permanence. It was a quiet echo. The miners, the first modern inhabitants of this land, had found something here, some remnant of the node's power, and incorporated it into their own rough-hewn mythology. They had felt the strange energy and recorded it in their own language. The deep history of the desert wasn't confined to the restricted military land. It was scattered everywhere in the dust, in the old shacks, waiting to be found. I placed the piece of wood back where I found it. It wasn't mine to keep. My only souvenir was the river stone which rested against my hand as I climbed back into the truck. The road ahead was long, but now it was a road of certainty, of quiet, shared knowledge with the land itself. I was headed for the edge of the desert, but the desert, with its long, slow, silent memory, was now deep inside me. The journey continued, measured in the slow drift of the clouds and the subtle shift in the color of the mountains as I drove further west. The story of the amber light was finished, but the feeling of the story, the peaceful unease of the cozy spooky, was still unfolding. The town of Echo and the cartographer's secret eye decided to take the longest, most meandering way home, sticking to the old state routes and avoiding the noisy, crowded interstates. I wanted the transition back to the everyday world to be as gradual and gentle as possible, allowing the quiet truth of the shining heart to settle fully. My next significant stop was a town I'd only seen mentioned on older, faded maps: Echo, Nevada. It was a settlement that had peaked during the uranium boom of the 1950s and then withered into near non-existence when the mines dried up. It promised a deeper layer of isolation, a quieter kind of abandonment. It took half a day of slow, careful driving on barely paved roads to reach it. When I arrived, Echo was exactly what the name implied: a ghost of a town. There were perhaps 8 standing structures, all made of sun-warped timber and rusty corrugated metal, all empty. No power lines, no pavement, no signs of recent human activity. It was just the wind, the dust, and the silence. I parked the truck in the center of what must have been the main street and walked slowly. The only sound was the creak of a loose shutter swinging on a hinge, a sound that seemed ridiculously loud in the vast quiet. I walked into the largest building, which must have been the general store. The shelves were long gone, but the floor was covered in debris, including thousands of tiny fragments of shattered glass from old bottles and windows. In the back, there was a small enclosed office space. The desk was still there, a heavy, dust-coated slab of dark wood, and on the desk, protected from the worst of the elements by a fallen piece of ceiling, was a book. Not a paperback, but a heavy, leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked, its pages brittle with age. I opened it carefully. It wasn't a store inventory. It was a journal of observations, written in a meticulous, looping hand that spoke of an educated, patient person. The entries dated from 1953 to 1959, the heyday of the uranium mining. The writer was a geologist, a man named Dr. Alastair Finch, who had been contracted to survey the land for mineral deposits. I began to read, running my finger over the delicate, faded script. Dr. Finch was clearly a man of science, but his journal slowly revealed a mind struggling to reconcile the rational with the unexplainable. His initial entries were about rock density and vein composition, but quickly the desert's quiet lore began to intrude. Entry, March 14, 1954. The men speak of the silent spots, areas where the compass spins and the radio refuses to carry a signal. They avoid these places, citing old Indian legends. I have been to 3 such spots. The silence is profound. It feels less like a natural phenomenon and more like an intentional void. Entry, May 2, 1954. The ore samples from the 3rd silent spot are peculiar. The background radiation is elevated but not dangerously so. What is odd is the composition of the rock. It is not native granite. It is a highly compressed, crystalline material I cannot identify. It is perfectly non-conductive, yet the Geiger counter registers a slight, rhythmic pulse when placed near it. The frequency of the pulse is incredibly slow, 1 beat every 90 seconds, a heartbeat of the Earth perhaps. Entry, July 19, 1955. The Air Force is moving in with great speed. They have sequestered the entire northern range, citing national security. The locals, the few that remain, are not surprised. They believe the government is here for the same reason the Watchers were here, the energy. I showed old Silas my map. He smiled and said they protect the lock, but they do not know the key. I asked him about the shining heart. He wrote only one word, beacon. The entry stopped me. Silas knew Dr. Finch. They had exchanged information, the meticulous man of science learning from the intuitive keeper of the desert. The Watcher's circular symbol, the core of light, was the beacon. I turned a few more pages, finding a large, fold-out map Dr. Finch had drawn in ink. It was an incredibly detailed survey of the entire valley, marking every ridge, every wash, every exposed seam of rock. And on this map, Dr. Finch had painstakingly marked 10 distinct points with a tiny, inked circle, each one labeled SS for silent spot. I traced them with my finger, my heart beating with a quiet excitement. One was clearly marked near the Devil's Drink. Another was located precisely at the boundary line, and a third was marked far to the north, deep in the mountains, right where the restricted zone began to curve into the highest peaks. He had mapped the entire network of nodes, the silent spots, the anchors for the shining heart. But the most incredible thing was written at the very bottom of the map, a single philosophical postscript that completed the picture. Hypothesis: the Watchers did not build a machine. They built a tuning fork. The nodes are not landing sites but precise points of resonance. The energy pulse is not a power source. It is a memory transmission. The amber light is the wave itself, resonating between the nodes only when the atmospheric pressure and electrical charge, such as during a massive storm, reach a perfect harmonic state. They didn't intend to power anything. They intended to create a beautiful, geometric, perfect silence, the tuning fork. The idea was beautiful, deeply poetic, and completely coherent with my experience. The light in the storm wasn't a UFO escaping the military. It was a wave of pure, geometric energy completing its circuit, resonating across the desert floor when the wind and dust provided the perfect catalyst. I carefully closed the journal, leaving it on the dusty desk for the next quiet visitor to find. I had gained far more than I had expected. A name, an origin, and a scientific basis for the profound mystery I had witnessed. The desert was indeed a vast, ancient instrument, and I had simply been there when it was briefly, violently played. I walked out of the old general store, the sun now high, casting long, sharp shadows. The town of Echo was silent, but now I knew its silence was not empty. It was full of quiet, resonant power, a subtle node in the vast, elegant network of the shining heart. I got back in the truck, feeling a deep, quiet gratitude for Dr. Finch, the long-dead geologist who had used his science to prove the beauty of a local legend. I drove on, the road ahead stretching out like an invitation to deeper thought. The last roadside inn and the dream my self-imposed, meandering journey continued for 2 more days. A slow, contemplative drive through the beautiful, lonely country that forms the deep edges of Nevada and Arizona. I ate simple meals, slept under the spectacular, uncaring stars, and let the quiet truth of the shining heart become an organic part of my reality. I was finally approaching the final fringe of the deep desert, the place where the road began to thicken with traffic, and the first distant glow of city lights could be seen on the horizon. I found a small, family-owned motel, one of those places with a appealing neon sign and a parking lot full of sun-baked cars, and decided to take a room for the night. I needed one last, quiet moment of civilization before plunging back into the noise of the world I had left behind. The room was clean, simple, and blessedly cool. I showered, scrubbing away the last, clinging dust of the restricted zone and the devil's drink. I felt lighter, calmer, and oddly cleansed. I lay down on the bed, pulling the smooth, heavy river stone from my pocket and placing it on the bedside table. I looked at my reflection in the dark television screen. I looked the same, but I knew I was profoundly different. I was carrying a beautiful, impossible truth that had no place in the loud conversations of the modern world. That night I had a dream. It wasn't a spectacular dream, full of flashing lights or screaming terror. It was a quiet dream, a slow, gentle experience that felt more like a memory than a nocturnal fabrication. I was standing on the hillock at the Devil's Drink near the three anchor depressions. The world was utterly still, but there was no storm. The air was clear and warm. In the dream, the amber light was there, fully and clearly manifest. It wasn't just a sphere or a pillar. It was a large, gently spinning lens, perfectly circular, resting maybe a foot off the ground, casting a soft, deep amber glow on the earth beneath it. As I watched, a gentle, almost musical whine began to emanate from the lens, a low frequency that resonated in my chest. And then the lens began to project something onto the ground in the center of the three anchors. It was an image, perfectly detailed, made of soft amber light. It was a moving, living hologram of the desert, but it was a desert I didn't know. The land was lush and green. Clear, wide rivers ran where the dusty washes now lay. The mountains were covered in deep, towering pines, and the petrified tree at the well was alive and vibrant, its leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. And there were people. They were tall, slender figures, moving with slow, elegant grace. They weren't wearing clothes, they seemed to be draped in long, flowing robes of deep, earth-toned fabric. They weren't working or fighting, they were simply observing. They would kneel by the rivers, place their hands on the living tree, and sit for hours perfectly still on the very hillock where I stood. They were the watchers. They weren't building a scientific outpost. They were tending a garden, a vast, silent, living sanctuary. The image shifted. The rivers began to dry, the green receded, and the desert began its long, slow march toward the arid landscape I knew. The watchers didn't panic. They didn't leave. They gathered at the anchor points, the nodes, and with slow, ritualistic movements, they activated the glowing lenses. As they did so, the vibrant, green memory of the living desert was captured and compressed into the core of the amber light, preserving the essence of the land before it was lost to time and climate. The last thing I saw in the dream was one of the watchers kneeling by the pillar at the boundary line. He placed his hand on the stone, and I felt the hum in the ground, and a voice, deep and resonant, whispered in my mind not in words but in a wave of perfect understanding. The silence is the protection. The light is the memory. We are the keepers of the potential. I woke up, startled not by a sudden noise but by the quiet realization that I was no longer dreaming. The room was dark and cool. My breathing was slow and even. The dream had been a complete, coherent explanation, a final gift of the shining heart's memory. I sat up, turning on the bedside lamp. The river stone sitting beside the lamp was faintly glistening, a slight film of condensation covering its cool surface. The experience was complete. I had seen the phenomenon, been given the lore, found the scientific structure, and finally received the intent. It was a closed loop, a perfect, satisfying narrative that asked for nothing more than quiet acceptance. I knew that when I drove away in the morning, I would be leaving the desert behind, but I would be taking its most profound quality with me. The quiet certainty that the greatest mysteries are often the most peaceful, the most subtle, and the most deeply resonant. The road back to the commonplace and the sleepy conclusion, the final leg of the journey, was the most challenging. As I drove further east, the world began to crowd in. The road widened to 4 lanes. The billboards became louder and more demanding. The sky was no longer a vast, star-strewn canvas, but a hazy, light-polluted ceiling. I was returning to the noisy, cluttered, impatient world of people. I felt a slight, profound sadness, a kind of peaceful melancholy for the absolute quiet I was leaving behind. I missed the roar of the sandstorm, the pure, raw energy that had allowed the truth to peek through. I missed Silas' slow, deliberate writing and Marge's knowing, tired eyes. I kept the river stone in my hand, letting its cool, smooth weight ground me in the reality of the desert's truth. It was my anti-anxiety device, my pocket-sized node. I stopped at a huge, bustling truck stop for a final cup of coffee before the long push home. The place was a chaos of ringing phones, blaring television news, slamming doors, and loud, hurried conversations. The noise was physically jarring after the quietude of the desert. I found a small, quiet corner booth, away from the worst of the noise. I drank my coffee slowly, watching the world rush by. I knew that if I were to tell my story here in this loud, demanding place, it would be swallowed whole. It would be dismissed as a delusion, a trick of the light, or a fabricated tale of an alien encounter. The shining heart wasn't meant for a place like this. Its truth required a receptive atmosphere, a mind slowed to the pace of the desert itself. I realized then that my journey was not about solving a mystery for the world. It was about receiving a gift for myself. The truth of the amber light was a personal node, a place of quiet resonance I could carry inside me. I finished my coffee. I put the cup down gently, its small click a quiet punctuation mark in the din. I knew what I would do with this memory. I would not shout it from the rooftops. I would keep it close, a silent, comforting secret. I would write about it, of course, but I would write about it slowly, weaving the threads of the storm, the petrified tree, and the watcher's memory into a long, quiet narrative, one that would only find its meaning when heard in the dark, with the mind ready to drift. A story that wouldn't shock or surprise but simply be like the desert itself. I stood up, adjusting my jacket. The exhaustion of the long journey was settling in, a gentle, welcome weight in my limbs. The excitement had passed, leaving behind a profound, sleepy calm. I walked back to the truck, opened the door, and slid the cool, smooth river stone back into the console. I had driven over 2,000 miles since seeing the light in the dust storm, but the only true distance traveled had been internal. I pulled back onto the busy highway, merging with the flow of traffic, but the noise of the world couldn't penetrate the quiet center I now possessed. The desert had stripped away the loud, external questions and given me a peaceful, internal answer. The memory of the impossible, silent, amber light, gliding unaffected through the roaring tempest, was now a permanent fixture in the deep, quiet spaces of my mind. It was a beautiful paradox, a flash of energy that resulted in perfect peace. The long drive was finally drawing to a close. My eyes were growing heavy, my thoughts beginning to drift into a soft, meandering haze. There was nothing left to do now but let the comfortable hum of the engine lull me, carrying me back to the familiar, allowing the vast, quiet memory of the shining heart to become nothing more than a gentle, peaceful background whisper, just beyond the reach of sleep. The desert had spoken, and now it was time to rest. Thank you for listening. For more content and support, please like, comment, and subscribe.